Don't
favor, você
cry,
tem que
sir,
sair
and my
daqui.
mom will prove
Eu
you're
não posso
innocent,
te perder.
even if everyone
É
at this
tarde
gala
demais,
turns
meu amor.
against you, the little girl
Mas eu
whispered to
sempre
the
vou te
Duke,
amar.
trapped in a ruthless accusation under the chandeliers. The ballroom shimmered like a constellation fallen to earth, each crystal drop of the chandeliers catching light and scattering it across silk gowns and polished marble. Laughter rippled through the crowd in careful waves, measured and musical, the kind of joy that required rehearsal. Servants moved like shadows between the luminous bodies of Paris's elite, carrying trays of champagne that cost more than a seamstress earned in a month. Helena's fingers ached as she adjusted the hem of a countess's gown in a dim corridor adjacent to the main hall. She worked quickly, needle flashing in the inadequate light, repairing a tear that had appeared when the woman stepped carelessly on her own train. The countess hadn't looked at her once, speaking instead to her companion about the tedium of perfection. One expects better craftsmanship from these establishments, the countess said, her voice floating over Helena's bent head like cigar smoke. Helena said nothing. She had learned years ago that invisibility was a kind of armor, that silence could deflect what words only amplified. Her daughter, Amelie, sat on a servant's stool nearby, swinging thin legs and watching the glittering crowd with the unguarded wonder of a child who hadn't yet learned that certain lights were not meant for her. The girl was 6 years old, dark-haired and slight, dressed in clothes Helena had sewn from remnants too damaged to sell. She had her father's eyes, though Helena tried not to think of that too often. Jean-Luc had been dead 3 years now, crushed beneath machinery in a factory that never acknowledged the accident beyond settling a sum so small it insulted his memory. The elite who ordered the fabrics and owned the buildings had moved on before his body was cold. Helena finished the repair and stood, her knees protesting. The countess swept away without acknowledgement, leaving only the faint scent of imported perfume. Helena gathered her sewing kit, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle into her shoulders. She had another commission waiting at home, a wedding dress for a merchant's daughter that needed beating by dawn. "Maman, can we see the dancing?" Amelie's voice was soft, hopeful. Helena looked toward the ballroom, where couples moved in synchronized elegance, their movements as choreographed as their reputations. She had been inside such rooms before, always at the edges, always temporary. She knew how quickly admiration could curdle into contempt when people remembered who she was. A widow who worked with her hands, a woman without protection or pedigree, someone the city had already judged and dismissed. "We should go home, mon cœur," Helena said gently. "It's late." But before they could leave, a senior servant appeared, his expression tight with urgency. "Madame Moreau, there's a tear on the Duchess's train. She insists you attend to it immediately." Helena felt something tighten in her chest. The Duchess was hosting tonight's gala, a woman known for her exacting standards and her willingness to humiliate those who disappointed her. Refusing wasn't an option, not if Helena wanted to keep receiving commissions from this household. "Of course," she said quietly. She followed the servant deeper into the palace, through corridors that grew progressively dimmer and colder, away from the warmth of the celebration. Amelie trailed behind, her small hand finding Helena's. They passed doors that led to storage rooms, servants' quarters,
Por
places
favor,
where the
você tem que
palace
sair
showed its
daqui.
unglamorous
Que eu não
skeleton.
posso te perder.
The servant stopped
É
before
tarde
an
demais,
ornate
meu
door,
amor.
gestured Helena
Mas eu sempre
inside,
vou te
and
amar.
disappeared before she could ask where the Duchess was. The room beyond was a private sitting area, lavishly decorated but empty. Helena hesitated, confusion prickling along her spine. "Hello," she called softly. No response came. She moved further inside, searching for any sign of the Duchess or the alleged damage. The room was silent except for the muffled music from the distant ballroom. She was about to turn back when she heard it, a sound so unexpected in this place of carefully maintained facades that it stopped her completely. Someone was crying. Not the delicate sniffles of social disappointment, but raw, broken sobs that spoke of genuine anguish. The sound came from somewhere beyond a heavy velvet curtain at the far end of the room. Helena's first instinct was to leave, to pretend she'd heard nothing. Other people's pain was a luxury she couldn't afford to carry. But Amelie had already slipped from her grasp, curiosity overcoming caution. The girl moved toward the curtain with the fearless directness of childhood. "Amelie, no," Helena whispered urgently, but her daughter had already pushed the fabric aside. Beyond the curtain was a small antechamber, barely larger than a closet, lit by a single oil lamp. And there, seated on a narrow bench with his head in his hands, was a man who seemed to occupy the space like a ghost haunting his own life. He looked up at the sound of their intrusion and Helena's breath caught. She knew this face. She had seen it years ago, across a crowded municipal hall, when workers had gathered to protest conditions that killed them slowly. He had been the only nobleman present, the only one who stood before the assembly and spoke not of charity but of justice, who used words like dignity and rights as if they applied to everyone equally. Now his face was gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. His fine clothes were rumpled, and there was a heaviness to him that went beyond physical exhaustion. He stared at them with a mixture of confusion and something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Monsieur," Amélie said solemnly, her child's voice unervingly clear in the charged silence, "you shouldn't cry. My maman can fix anything." The man's eyes moved from the child to Helena, and she saw recognition flicker across his features, not of her specifically but of what she represented. A working woman. A seamstress. Someone who didn't belong in this wing of the palace, certainly not in this hidden room where he sat like a prisoner awaiting execution. "You should leave," he said, his voice hoarse from crying. "This is no place for you." Helena's instinct agreed with him. Everything about this situation screamed danger. The isolated location, the strange summons that had brought her here, the broken nobleman before her. But Amélie had already moved closer, her small face creased with concern in that way children have when they encounter suffering they don't yet understand how to fear. "Why are you locked in here?" the girl asked. "Are you being punished?" The man's laugh was bitter, without humor. "Yes. Though not in the way you imagine." Helena finally found her voice. "Come, Amélie. We're leaving." She reached for her daughter's hand, but the girl resisted, planted stubbornly in place. "But maman," he sat. "Like you were when Papa." "Amélie." The sharpness in Helena's tone made the
Por
girl
favor, você tem
flinch.
que sair daqui.
She softened
Eu não
immediately,
posso te
kneeling
perder.
to meet her daughter's
É tarde
eyes.
demais, meu amor.
Sometimes helping means knowing
Mas eu
when to
sempre
walk
vou te
away.
amar.
"This isn't our concern." "Actually," the man said quietly, "perhaps it should be someone's concern. Though God knows I have no right to ask." Helena straightened slowly, studying him more carefully. He wore the clothes of nobility, a fine waistcoat, trousers of expensive wool, but they hung on him as if he'd shrunk inside them. His hands trembled slightly, and there was a wild, desperate quality to his gaze that made her uneasy. Yet beneath the desperation she recognized something else. The same quality she'd seen years ago when he'd stood before angry crowds and privileged bureaucrats alike, speaking truths that earned him enemies in both directions. Integrity. Or what remained of it after the world had tried to beat it out of him. "What happened to you?" The question escaped before Helena could stop it. He studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether honesty was worth the effort. "I made the mistake of being right when powerful men needed me to be wrong. I defended workers when investors wanted exploitation. I exposed corruption when silence would have been profitable." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And when I wouldn't bend, they broke me another way. They accused me of ruining a business partner, of fraud and betrayal." The trial was 3 days long. The verdict was decided before it began. Helena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew this story, had lived versions of it herself. Justice in Paris wasn't blind, it merely chose not to see certain people, certain truths. "They're going to strip me of my title publicly," he continued, his voice hollow. "Tomorrow night in the main hall before everyone who once called me friend. They want it to be humiliating, a warning to anyone else who might think principles matter more than profits." "Can't you fight it?" Amélie asked, her voice small. "With what?" He spread his hands helplessly. "I've been confined to these rooms for 2 weeks. My assets are frozen. My lawyers have been threatened. Every witness who might speak for me has been convinced, through persuasion or intimidation, to remain silent. The man orchestrating this is my own cousin, who stands to inherit everything once I'm disgraced." Helena absorbed this information, feeling the familiar weight of injustice pressing against her ribs. She had learned long ago that fairness was a luxury the powerful dispensed selectively, that the law protected those who could afford its protection. She had watched her husband's death be reduced to a line in a ledger, compensation calculated by men who'd never worked a day with their hands. But she had also learned that survival meant choosing your battles carefully, that martyrdom fed no children and paid no rent. "I'm sorry for your situation," she said carefully. "But I don't see how I can help you." He nodded, unsurprised. "You can't. No one can. His voice cracked. "I haven't spoken to anyone in days except guards and my cousin's lawyers. When your daughter appeared I forgot myself. Forgive me." Amélie looked up at Helena with those devastating eyes, the ones that saw the world as it should be rather than as it was. "Maman, you always say we should help people who are treated unfairly. Life is more complicated than that, mon cœur." "Is it?" The man's question was soft but pointed. Or do we just tell ourselves that to excuse our silence? The
Por
words
favor,
hit
você tem que
harder than
sair
Helena
daqui.
expected,
Eu não
perhaps
posso te
because she'd
perdoar.
asked herself the
É
same
tarde
question
demais, meu
countless
amor.
times. Every
Mas eu
time she
sempre vou te
swallowed an
amar.
insult, every time she accepted less than she deserved, every time she taught Amelie to make herself smaller to survive, she wondered if she was being practical or complicit. She looked at him properly now, this man who'd once stood up when others sat down, who'd paid for his principles with everything he had. She remembered the day he'd testified before the municipal assembly. He'd looked directly at the workers in attendance, not through them or past them, and he'd spoken about them as if they were human beings deserving of dignity. It had been such a small thing, that basic respect, and yet so rare that Helena had carried the memory for years. "I remember you," she said abruptly. 4 years ago. The hearing about factory conditions. His eyes widened slightly. "You were there?" "In the back. With other garment workers. You argued that we deserved safe facilities and fair wages. You said," she paused, the exact words surfacing from memory. "You said that a society that profits from suffering has no right to call itself civilized." "I remember writing that speech," he said softly. "My colleagues called it naive. Dangerous even. They were right about the danger at least." Helena felt something shift inside her, a dangerous loosening of the careful walls she'd built. This man had risked his standing for people like her when he had nothing to gain from it. And now he sat in this cold room, abandoned by everyone who'd once benefited from his name, waiting for a final humiliation designed to destroy whatever remained of his reputation. She thought of Jean-Luc, dying alone on a factory floor while managers calculated the cheapest way to dispose of the problem. She thought of every time she'd been invisible, every time her labor had been essential but her humanity optional. "What's your name?" Helena asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Etienne Marchand. Duke of Valois for another day at least." He said it without pride, the title hanging on him like borrowed clothes that no longer fit. Helena made a decision that her rational mind immediately questioned. She set down her sewing kit and moved closer, lowering herself to sit on the edge of the bench, maintaining a careful distance. Amelie settled beside her, quiet now, sensing the weight of adult decisions being made. "Tell me exactly what they're accusing you of." Etienne looked at her with surprise, then suspicion. "Why?" "Because I'm trying to decide if you're worth the risk." He almost smiled at that, a ghost of expression that suggested he'd once had a sense of humor. "Fair enough." He took a breath, organizing his thoughts. 2 years ago, I entered a partnership with a merchant named Auguste Fournier. We were importing textiles from Lyon, paying fair wages to the weavers, establishing better working conditions. It was profitable, but not as profitable as it could have been if we'd exploited the workers. Helena knew that story from the other side, the rare workshops where people were treated as human beings rather than machinery. They existed, but barely, always struggling against competitors who had no such scruples. My cousin, Philippe Marchand, wanted in on the business. When I refused to bring him aboard, I knew he'd undermine everything we'd built. He went to Fournier directly. Offered him a partnership that would triple profits by cutting wages and extending hours. Fournier
Por
refused.
favor, você tem que sair
Etienne's hands
daqui.
clenched.
Eu não posso
3
te
months later,
perdoar.
Fournier's
É tarde
finances
demais, meu
collapsed.
amor.
His accounts were
Mas eu
drained,
sempre vou
his
te amar.
creditworthiness destroyed. He lost everything. And they blamed you? Philippe created documents showing that I'd been siphoning funds from the partnership. Forged signatures, falsified records, witnesses who swore they'd seen me meeting with Fournier's competitors. The evidence was meticulous because it was manufactured by people who understand how power works. Helena had seen this kind of corruption before, though never at this scale. The mechanics were the same whether you were ruining a duke or a seamstress. You controlled the narrative, bought the witnesses, and made sure the victim had no platform to defend themselves. What happened to Fournier? Etienne's face darkened. He died 6 months ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. But I think it was despair. He lost his business, his reputation, his home. He tried to testify on my behalf, but by then he was considered unreliable, a failed merchant with an axe to grind. Convenient timing, Helena said quietly. Isn't it always? The bitterness in his voice was earned. Amelie had been listening with the intense focus children bring to conversations they don't fully understand but sense are important. So you didn't do the bad thing they said? No, little one. I didn't. Then we have to prove it, she said simply, as if justice were just a matter of showing people the truth. Helena wished the world worked that way. Even if we could prove his innocence, who would listen? The trial is over. The verdict is sealed. The ceremony tomorrow isn't a trial, Etienne said. It's theater. They want the humiliation to be public, memorable. A duke brought low before his peers. But the actual legal proceedings are finished. I've been confined here until they're ready to parade me out. So you're already convicted. In every way that matters, yes. Helena stood, pacing the small space. Her mind worked through possibilities, each one collapsing under the weight of reality. She had no connections, no influence, no resources beyond a needle and thread. What could she possibly do against men who commanded wealth and power? But then, powerful men rarely noticed seamstresses. They spoke freely in front of servants, treated working women as part of the furniture. She'd been invisible in these halls for years, which meant she'd also been ignored. And people who were ignored often saw and heard things they weren't supposed to. The witnesses, she said abruptly. The ones who testified against you. Do you know who they were? Some I knew. Business associates of Philippe's, mostly. People who owed him favors or feared his retaliation. Why? Because people like that talk. They brag about their cleverness, complain about what they're owed for their cooperation. And they do it in places where people like me are present but not seen. Etienne stood as well, hope flickering cautiously across his face. You think you could find evidence? I think I could listen. Which is more than you can do from this room. Helena, may I call you Helena? At her slight nod, he continued, this is dangerous. Philippe is ruthless. If he suspects you're helping me, he won't hesitate to destroy you too. You have a daughter to protect. I've been protecting her in a city that treats us as disposable for 3 years, Helena said. I know how to be careful. It's not the same. Philippe operates on a different level.
Por favor,
He can
você tem
ruin
que
you
sair
with a
daqui.
word, have you
Eu não
blacklisted
posso te
from every
perdoar.
decent commission in
É tarde
Paris.
demais, meu
Or
amor.
worse.
Mas
Helena
eu
met
sempre
his
vou
eyes
te amar.
steadily. You stood up for people like me when you had everything to lose. I remember thinking how rare that was, how most nobles wouldn't risk a dinner invitation for our sake, let alone their reputation. You did it anyway. She paused. I'm not promising miracles. I'm not even promising success. But I can try. If you'll let me. Etienne looked at her for a long moment, and Helena saw something shift in his expression, surprise giving way to a kind of wondering gratitude that made her uncomfortable because she wasn't used to being looked at as if she mattered. Why? He asked finally. Why would you risk anything for me? Helena considered the question honestly. Because Amélie is watching. And I need her to learn that dignity isn't something you wait to receive. It's something you fight for even when the odds are impossible. The practical arrangements came next, discussed in hushed tones while Amélie dozed against Helena's shoulder. Etienne explained the layout of his confinement. He was allowed to move between 3 rooms in this isolated wing, always under guard, though the guards changed shifts and weren't particularly attentive. His cousin visited daily, ostensibly to discuss the transfer of assets, but really to gloat. Philippe enjoyed describing exactly how tomorrow's ceremony would unfold, the precise choreography of Etienne's disgrace. He's thorough, Etienne said with grudging respect for his enemy's competence. Every detail planned, every potential complication anticipated. He's been orchestrating this for over a year. Then he's had time to become arrogant, Helena observed. Arrogant people make mistakes. She explained her plan such as it was. She would return to her regular commissions, moving through the households of Paris's elite as she always did, invisible, industrious, beneath notice. She would listen for mentions of the Marchand case, any loose threads Philippe might have left exposed. She would identify the witnesses and find ways to be present when they spoke freely. It was hardly a strategy, more a direction, but it was something. How will you get information to me? Etienne asked. Helena considered. I can't visit regularly without drawing attention. But I can leave messages. Does anyone bring you meals? A kitchen servant, twice daily. An older man, Martin. He's kind, doesn't speak much. I know Martin, Helena said, a plan forming. He brings linens to be mended sometimes. If I can convince him to carry messages, we'd have a channel. That's asking him to risk his position. Let me worry about that. Helena stood, gently shifting Amélie in her arms. The girl stirred but didn't wake. I should go before someone notices how long we've been here. The Duchess's torn hem was clearly a ruse to get me away from the main gathering. I don't know who sent that servant to bring me here, but they might be watching to see what I do next. Etienne rose as well, and for the first time Helena noticed how tall he was, how his presence filled the small space despite his diminished state. Before you go, there's something you should know. Philippe didn't just forge documents. He killed Fournier. The words hung in the air like smoke. Helena felt her chest tighten. You said heart failure. That's what the death certificate says. but Fournier was healthy, barely 50 years old. And 2 days before he died, he
Por
sent me a
favor, você
letter.
tem que sair
It was
daqui.
intercepted,
Eu não
but I
posso
heard
te
about it
perder.
from a sympathetic
É
clerk.
tarde demais, meu
In
amor.
it, he said he'd found proof
Mas eu
of the
sempre vou te
forgeries,
amar.
that he was taking it to the authorities. He died that same night. Helena's mind raced through the implications. You're saying your cousin committed? She stopped herself, glancing at Amelie's sleeping form, unwilling to speak the word aloud. I'm saying Philippe will do whatever necessary to protect his scheme. And if he perceives you as a threat, he won't hesitate. Etienne moved closer, his voice urgent. I'm grateful for your help, truly. But please be careful. Don't take risks that could endanger you or your daughter. Helena adjusted Amelie's weight in her arms, feeling the familiar burden and gift of her child's trust. I'll be careful. But monsieur. Etienne, please. Etienne. The name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar, the kind of intimacy that crossed invisible lines. If your cousin is capable of what you're suggesting, then doing nothing is also dangerous. Men like that don't stop. They expand. Today it's you, tomorrow it's someone else. The only safety is in stopping them. He looked at her with something between admiration and sorrow. You sound like someone who's learned that lesson the hard way. My husband died because factory owners decided safety measures were too expensive. They paid off inspectors, buried reports, made sure no one with power cared enough to intervene. 3 men died that day, but the factory never even closed for repairs. Helena's voice remained steady, though the old anger still burned beneath the surface. I learned that waiting for justice is another way of accepting injustice. Etienne nodded slowly. Then we understand each other. Helena moved toward the curtain, then paused. The ceremony tomorrow, will you be able to get word to me about what happens? What Philippe says, how he behaves? I'll try. Though I'll be somewhat preoccupied with my public humiliation. Despite everything, Helena almost smiled. Try to remember details anyway. The more we understand how he operates, the better chance we have of finding a weakness. She slipped through the curtain and crossed the sitting room, listening carefully for sounds in the corridor beyond. The palace was quieter now, the gala winding down. She could hear distant voices, the clink of glasses being collected, servants beginning the long process of returning the building to its daytime order. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. She moved quickly, retracing her steps toward the service areas where she belonged. Amelie stirred against her shoulder. Maman, the girl murmured. Is the sad man going to be okay? I don't know, mon cœur. But we're going to try to help him. Because it's right? Because it's right. They emerged into a busier corridor where other servants were moving with purpose, clearing the aftermath of the evening's excess. No one looked at Helena twice, just another working woman finishing her shift, carrying a sleepy child home. She collected her sewing kit from where she'd left it earlier and made her way toward the servants' exit. But as she passed through a narrow passageway near the kitchens, she nearly collided with a man in expensive evening clothes. He stepped back with exaggerated courtesy, and Helena's stomach dropped when she recognized him from descriptions Etienne had provided. Philippe Marchand was handsome in the way of men who'd never struggled, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't reach his calculating eyes.
Por
He
favor,
looked
você
at
tem que
Helena
sair
with the
daqui.
bland
Eu
curiosity
não
one
posso
might
te
direct
perder.
at an interesting
É tarde
insect.
demais, meu amor.
Working late? He asked
Mas eu sempre
pleasantly.
vou te amar.
Yes, monsieur. A repair for one of the guests. Dedicated. I admire that. His gaze flicked to Amelie, then back to Helena. You're the seamstress, aren't you? Madame Moreau? That he knew her name was alarming. Helena kept her expression neutral. Yes, monsieur. My cousin used to speak highly of workers like you. People who take pride in their craft, who deserve fair treatment. His tone was conversational, but something cruel flickered behind it. He had such idealistic notions about the dignity of labor. It's tragic, really, how those ideals blinded him to his own corruption. Helena understood she was being tested, that Philippe was probing to see if she knew anything, if she posed any threat. She bowed her head slightly, playing the role he expected. I wouldn't know about such things, monsieur. I only sew. Of course. How wise to stay in one's place. He smiled again, and this time Helena saw the warning beneath the pleasantness. The world is dangerous for those who reach beyond their station. I'd hate to see anything unfortunate happen to you or your charming daughter. The threat lingered in Helena's mind long after she'd left the palace, carried home through dark streets where gas lamps cast uncertain circles of light. Amelie had fallen back asleep, her weight growing heavier with each block, and Helena's arms ached by the time she climbed the narrow stairs to their third-floor apartment. The building smelled of cooking grease and damp plaster, familiar scents that usually meant safety but tonight felt suffocating. She laid Amélie in the small bed they shared and stood for a moment watching her daughter sleep, thinking about Philippe's veiled warning. Men like him didn't make idle remarks. He'd identified her as a potential variable and had delivered his message with surgical precision. Stay invisible, stay silent, or suffer consequences. Helena moved to the window and looked out over the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, Etienne sat in his elegant prison, waiting for dawn and the orchestrated destruction of his name. And somewhere else, Philippe was probably celebrating, confident that every piece of his scheme remained perfectly positioned. She should walk away. The sensible part of her brain screamed it. She had survived this long by knowing which battles were impossible, by understanding that some injustices were too large for one seamstress to challenge. Amélie needed a mother who was present, not one who'd been crushed trying to fight men with infinite resources. But when Helena closed her eyes, she saw Jean-Luc's face, remembered the factory owner who'd shaken her hand at the funeral with manufactured sympathy while his lawyers ensured she received the minimum settlement. She remembered swallowing her rage because rage without power was just another way to destroy yourself. Yet here was a different kind of power. Not the kind that commanded armies or moved legislation, but the power of being underestimated. Of moving through spaces where truth was spoken carelessly because the speakers believed no one important was listening. Helena made her decision for the second time that night, more deliberately now. She would help Etienne not because she could guarantee success, but because the alternative was teaching Amélie that justice only mattered when it was convenient. Sleep came in fragments. She rose before dawn and began work on the merchant's daughter's wedding dress, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency while her mind planned. By the time pale light filtered through the window, she'd finished the beating and had compiled a mental list of households where she might gather information. The ceremony stripping Etienne of his title would take place that evening. She couldn't attend, such events were strictly for the elite, but she knew servants who would be present, invisible witnesses to the spectacle. If she positioned herself correctly, she might learn something useful about Philippe's network, identify weaknesses in his performance. After settling Amélie with the elderly neighbor who watched her during work hours, Helena delivered the completed wedding dress and collected her payment. Then she made her way to the Montrose household, where she had a standing commission to alter Madame Montrose's extensive wardrobe. The woman changed her mind about hemlines as often as the weather shifted, which meant Helena spent considerable time in her dressing room, often while Madame entertained friends. Today fortune aligned. Helena had been working silently for less than an hour when voices drifted from the adjacent sitting room. She recognized Madame Montrose's theatrical tones, accompanied by two other women whose names Helena didn't know but whose voices carried the particular pitch of gossip being savored. "It's tonight, isn't it?" one woman said. "The Marchand ceremony?" "Yes, at the Palais Garnier. Philippe insisted on the grandest venue possible. He wants everyone to witness his cousin's disgrace." Madame Montrose sounded gleeful. "I hear Etienne will be required to publicly apologize and renounce his title." "It's almost too cruel," the second woman said, though her tone suggested she found it appropriately cruel. "But then, fraud is unforgivable. To betray a business partner so completely." "I never trusted him," Madame Montrose interrupted. "All that talk about workers' rights and fair wages. It was always suspicious, wasn't it? Like he was compensating for some hidden corruption." Helena's needle paused for half a breath before resuming its rhythm. She'd heard this before, how Etienne's principles had been reinterpreted as evidence of guilt, his advocacy twisted into proof of hypocrisy. It was a neat trick making virtue look like vice. "Philippe has been so dignified through all of this," the first woman continued. "Imagine discovering your own cousin had been stealing, and still showing such restraint. He could have had Etienne imprisoned, but instead he's allowing him to leave Paris with some dignity intact." "Well, not much dignity after tonight," Madame Montrose laughed. "But yes, Philippe has been remarkably gracious. And he'll make a far better duke. He understands how things actually work, isn't burdened by idealism." The conversation drifted to other topics: fashion, upcoming social events, the usual concerns of women insulated from struggle. Helena continued working, her mind filing away each detail. Philippe had carefully crafted his public image, positioned himself as the reasonable party, the victim of family betrayal who nonetheless acted with restraint. It was masterful, really. By the time the truth came out, if it ever did, public opinion would be so firmly shaped that contradictory evidence would seem like desperate fabrication. She finished her work and collected payment, then made her way toward the palace kitchens. Martin, the servant who brought Etienne his meals, usually collected bread from the palace bakery around midday. If she could intercept him casually, establish a connection, perhaps she could lay groundwork for using him as a messenger. The
Por
kitchen
favor, você
area
tem que sair
bustled with
daqui.
activity,
Eu não posso te
preparations
perder.
underway for tonight's
É tarde
ceremony.
demais, meu amor.
Helena slipped in through a
Mas eu
service
sempre vou
entrance,
te amar.
carrying a bundle of linens she'd borrowed from her own meager supply as an excuse for her presence. She spotted Martin near the bread ovens, filling a tray with careful attention. "Monsieur Martin," she called softly. He turned, his weathered face creasing with recognition. "Madame Moreau. What brings you here?" "I was hoping to speak with you about some linens that need mending. The head of household mentioned you might know which items require attention." It was a thin pretext, but Martin seemed to accept it. They moved to a quieter corner, away from the kitchen's organized chaos. Helena glanced around to ensure no one was particularly interested in their conversation. "Actually," she said quietly, "I wanted to ask about someone you've been serving." "The Duke." Etienne Marchand. Martin's expression shuddered immediately, wariness replacing his previous friendliness. "I just bring him meals, madam. I don't involve myself in noble affairs." "I'm not asking you to involve yourself. Helena chose her words carefully. "I spoke with him briefly yesterday. He seemed like a decent man in terrible circumstances. Decent or not isn't for me to judge." But Martin's eyes held something that contradicted his neutral words. Sympathy, perhaps, or the kind of doubt that comes from witnessing injustice up close. Helena took a calculated risk. "My husband died in a factory accident 3 years ago. The owners paid almost nothing and no one in power cared enough to investigate. I learned then that justice is selective." She paused, letting the words settle. "I also learned that sometimes the only people who care about truth are those who have nothing to gain from lies." Martin studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Around them, the kitchen noise provided cover, clattering pots, shouted orders, the general chaos of preparation. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I've been bringing the Duke his meals for 2 weeks. In that time I've watched him deteriorate. Not because he's guilty and consumed by remorse, but because he's innocent and consumed by helplessness." Martin glanced toward the kitchen entrance, checking for observers. "I've served nobility all my life. I know the difference between a man who's been caught and a man who's been framed." "Then you believe him?" "What I believe doesn't matter. The ceremony is tonight. By morning he'll be stripped of everything and exiled from Paris. Belief without action is just another form of silence." Helena recognized the bitterness in his voice, the frustration of witnessing injustice while feeling powerless to prevent it. What if there were action? Small actions but meaningful ones. Martin's eyes narrowed. "What are you proposing?" "I'm going to try to find evidence that Philippe fabricated the charges. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I'm going to try. And if I do find something, I'll need a way to communicate with the Duke. To coordinate, to plan." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to carry messages. Nothing that would put you in direct danger, just folded notes among the linens or hidden in meal trays. If I'm caught, I'll lose my position. Probably worse. I know. And I won't blame you if you refuse. But I remember something the Duke said years ago at a hearing about worker conditions. He said that those who can act but choose not to become
Por favor,
complicit in
você tem que
whatever
sair
follows.
daqui.
I've thought
Eu não
about that a
posso te
lot."
perder.
Martin was
É tarde
quiet
demais,
for a
meu
long
amor.
moment, weighing
Mas eu
invisible
sempre vou te
scales.
amar.
Finally he nodded once, curtly. "I'll carry messages. But if this becomes too dangerous, if Philippe's people start watching too closely, I stop. I have a family to feed." "Understood. And thank you." He handed her a piece of paper and a stub of pencil from his pocket. "Write whatever you need to tell him. I leave with his midday meal in 20 minutes." Helena moved to a corner where she could write unobserved, composing her message carefully. Her handwriting was unpracticed but legible, each word chosen for maximum information with minimum space. "Met your cousin last night. He knows who I am. Will proceed carefully. Attending households today, Montrose, Beaumont, Mercier. Listening for names, connections. The ceremony tonight, stay strong. Remember they need your cooperation for maximum humiliation. Deny them that." She folded the paper small and tight, handing it back to Martin. He tucked it into his vest without looking at it, his face betraying nothing. Then he collected his tray and disappeared into the palace's interior corridors. Helena left through the service entrance and spent the afternoon moving between households, offering her services for quick repairs and alterations. In each location, she listened with a seamstress's patient attention, gathering fragments of conversation like dropped stitches that might reveal the larger pattern. At the Beaumont residence, she overheard a business associate of Philippe's complaining about being summoned to testify. As if I had time for legal proceedings, the man grumbled. But Philippe made it worth the inconvenience. Very generous, actually. At the Mercier household, a lawyer's wife mentioned how unusual it was that the case had proceeded so quickly. Usually these matters take months, even years. But Philippe seemed determined to resolve it before summer. One wonders why the rush. Each piece of information was small, almost meaningless in isolation. But together they suggested a pattern. Witnesses who'd been compensated, proceedings that had been expedited, a timeline driven by Philippe's urgency rather than legal necessity. The question was why? What made speed essential to his scheme? As evening approached, Helena collected Amélie and returned home. The ceremony would be starting soon, and there was nothing more she could do today except wait. She fed her daughter a simple meal of bread and soup, listening to the child's chatter about her day with the neighbor, trying to focus on normalcy while her mind churned with strategy. After Amélie fell asleep, Helena sat by the window and tried to imagine what was happening at the Palais Garnier. Etienne, standing before an audience of his former peers, forced to speak words of contrition for crimes he hadn't committed, watching his title and reputation dissolve like sugar in water. She wondered if he would maintain his composure, deny Philippe the satisfaction of seeing him break. She must have dozed because she woke to knocking at her door. The sound was soft but insistent, an alarm jolted through her. No one visited at this hour unless something was wrong. She moved quickly to the door, checking through the gap to see who stood in the dim hallway. Martin. His face was pale, his expression urgent. Helena opened the door just wide enough for him to slip inside. What happened? The ceremony, he said, breathing hard as if he'd run the entire way. It went wrong. Wrong how? The Duke refused to apologize. When Philippe tried to force him to renounce his title publicly, Etienne called him a liar and a thief before everyone. Said Philippe had orchestrated everything, that Fournier's death wasn't natural, that the whole case was fabricated. Martin paused, catching his breath. It was chaos. Philippe tried to have him removed, but some of the older nobility demanded explanations. The ceremony ended early, everyone arguing, the whole thing falling apart. Helena felt her heart racing. Etienne had chosen confrontation over capitulation, had weaponized the very public forum Philippe intended for his humiliation. It was brave and possibly suicidal, but it had created something Philippe couldn't control: doubt. Where is he now? Back in his rooms, under heavier guard. Philippe is furious from what I hear. He's calling emergency meetings with his lawyers, trying to contain the damage. Martin reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper. The Duke gave me this. He found a moment when the guards were distracted by all the confusion. Helena unfolded the message, tilting it toward the lamplight to read Etienne's hurried scrawl. I've bought us time but made Philippe desperate. He'll move to silence anyone who might support my accusations. There's a clerk at the prefecture, Laurent Dubois, who processed the financial documents. He expressed doubts privately about some signatures. Find him before Philippe does. Be careful. You were right about choosing action. Thank you for reminding me. Helena read the message twice, committing the name to memory before holding it to the lamp's flame and watching it curl into ash. Laurent Dubois. A clerk who'd noticed irregularities, which meant he'd seen something in those forged documents that didn't align properly. If she could reach him first, convince him to testify about what he'd observed, it might be enough to force a real investigation. But Philippe would be thinking the same thing. He'd already demonstrated he was willing to ensure silence permanently. I need to find this clerk tomorrow, Helena said. Early, before Philippe's people locate him. Martin nodded. The prefecture opens at 7. If you're there when it opens, you might catch him arriving for work. Will you take another message to the Duke? Let him know I'm following this lead? I'll try. But security has been increased. It might not be possible. Do what you can. And Martin, thank you. You're taking real risks for someone you barely know. The older man's face softened slightly. My son works in a factory. Fair wages, safe conditions because the owner happens to be decent. But most aren't. The Duke fought for regulations that would have protected workers like my boy. I haven't forgotten that. He moved toward the door then paused. Be careful tomorrow. If Philippe is as dangerous as the Duke suggests, you're walking into real danger. After Martin left, Helena stood in the quiet apartment, feeling the weight of what she'd committed to. Tomorrow she would try to convince a government clerk to risk his career, possibly his life, to speak truth against a powerful nobleman. The odds of success were minimal. The odds of consequences were certain. She looked at Amelie sleeping peacefully, unaware of the choices her mother was making. Helena had told her daughter that dignity required fighting for, even against impossible odds. Now she had to prove she believed it. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made Paris look like a charcoal sketch of itself. Helena rose quietly, dressed in her most respectable clothes, a dark wool dress she'd sewn from fabric too flawed to sell but still presentable, and braided her hair with care. She needed to appear credible, serious, someone a government clerk might trust rather than dismiss. She left Amelie with the neighbor earlier than usual, murmuring vague explanations about an important commission. The woman asked no questions, accustomed to the unpredictable schedules of those who survived by their labor. The prefecture loomed gray and imposing in the early light, its stone facade designed to project authority and permanence. Helena approached with her stomach tight, aware that she was stepping into unfamiliar territory. She'd spent her life avoiding official buildings, places where her class and status marked her as supplicant rather than citizen. Clerks and officials began arriving as the city stirred to life. Helena positioned herself near the main entrance, watching faces, trying to identify Laurent Dubois from nothing more than a name and the hope that he'd look like someone burdened by conscience. After 20 minutes, she approached a young clerk who seemed less intimidating than the others. "Excuse me, monsieur. I'm looking for Laurent Dubois. Is he here yet?" The young man glanced at her, his expression reflexively dismissive before bureaucratic courtesy reasserted itself. "Dubois works in financial records. 3rd floor, East Wing. But he won't be in today." Helena's heart sank. "Do you know why?" "Called in sick, apparently. First time in years, which is why people are talking about it." The clerk shrugged. "If you need something from financial records, someone else can help you." "No, thank you. I needed to speak with him specifically." Helena left the prefecture with her mind racing. Laurent Dubois, who never missed work, had suddenly taken sick the morning after Etienne's public accusation. Either he was genuinely ill or Philippe had already reached him. She needed to find where Dubois lived, needed to determine if he was hiding, threatened, or worse. She spent the next hour asking careful questions of people who might know: a clerk at a nearby cafe where prefecture workers took their morning coffee, a courier who delivered documents. Finally, she learned that Dubois lived in a modest building in the Marais district, a neighborhood of narrow streets and buildings that leaned against each other like tired workers. The address led her to a 4-story walk-up with peeling paint and windows that rattled in their frames. Helena climbed to the 2nd floor and knocked on the door marked with Dubois's name. No answer came. She knocked again, harder. "He's not there," a voice said behind her. Helena turned to find an elderly woman emerging from the adjacent apartment, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Do you know where he went?" "Left before dawn with a traveling case. Looked frightened, if you ask me. Kept looking over his shoulder like someone might be following." The woman studied Helena. "You a friend of his?" "Not exactly. But I need to speak with him urgently." "Did he say where he was going?" "Didn't say anything. But I heard him tell the landlord he'd be gone a week, maybe more. Asked for his rent to be held." The woman leaned closer, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "Had a visitor last night late. Well-dressed man, fancy carriage. They argued something fierce. Couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear enough. Threats. Philippe's people had already found him. And Dubois had run rather than face whatever consequences had been implied." Helena couldn't blame him, but it left her with nothing. No witness, no testimony, no evidence beyond Etienne's word against Philippe's manufactured documentation. She thanked the neighbor and left, her mind working through alternatives. If Dubois wouldn't testify, she needed to find the documents themselves, needed to identify the specific irregularities he'd noticed. But accessing financial records at the prefecture would be impossible for someone like her. She had no official standing, no authority to request such materials. Unless she could convince someone with authority to request them on her behalf. The thought came with immediate complications. Who would help her? What lawyer or official would risk their reputation on the word of a seamstress claiming a duke had been framed? She'd be laughed out of any respectable office, assuming she even got through the door. But there was one person who might listen. One person who'd already shown he cared about worker rights and wasn't entirely captured by elite interests. The memory surfaced from years ago, a young lawyer who'd represented garment workers in a wage dispute, who'd argued their case despite knowing he'd never be paid adequately. She couldn't remember his full name, only that other workers had called him Maître Rousseau. Helena made her way to the legal district, asking at various offices until she found the right one. Maître André Rousseau maintained a small practice in a building that had seen better decades, his name painted on a door that needed refinishing. She climbed the stairs and knocked. "Come in," a voice called. The office was cramped and disorganized, papers stacked on every surface, law books stuffed into shelves without any apparent system. Behind a desk cluttered with case files sat a man in his 40s, his hair prematurely gray, his face showing the kind of fatigue that came from fighting losing battles. He looked up as Helena entered, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to cautious attention. "Can I help you?" "Maître Rousseau, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Helena Moreau. You represented garment workers about 4 years ago, a dispute with the Marchand textile workshops." Recognition flickered across his face. "I remember. We lost that case, though I argued we'd been right on the merits. The law, unfortunately, tends to favor those who can afford better lawyers." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit. What brings you here?" Helena sat, organizing her thoughts. She had one chance to convince this man, and everything depended on how she presented the situation. "I need help investigating a case. The Marchand fraud case, the Duke who was stripped of his title." Rousseau's expression became guarded. "That case is closed. The verdict was rendered, the sentence carried out. The verdict was bought. The evidence was forged. And the real criminal is free while an innocent man has lost everything. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "Not yet. That's why I need your help." Helena leaned forward, speaking with quiet intensity. "I know how this sounds. I'm nobody, just a seamstress, and I'm asking you to believe that an entire legal proceeding was fabricated. But hear me out." She told him everything: her encounter with Etienne, his history of advocating for workers, Philippe's motive and opportunity, the convenient death of Auguste Fournier, the
Por favor,
witnesses who'd
você tem
been
que sair
compensated,
daqui.
the clerk
Eu não
who'd fled
posso te
after being
perder.
threatened.
É tarde
She spoke
demais, meu amor.
carefully, presenting facts
Mas eu
rather than
sempre vou te
emotions,
amar.
building her case the way she imagined a lawyer would. Rousseau listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence filled the small office. "Why are you doing this?" Rousseau asked finally. "You said yourself you're nobody. The Duke is nothing to you. Why risk Philippe Marchand's wrath?" Helena met his eyes steadily. "Because 4 years ago the Duke testified on behalf of workers he didn't know, risking his standing with his own class. He said we deserved dignity, fair treatment, legal protection. Most nobles wouldn't cross the street to help us, but he stood in front of officials and business owners and argued for our humanity." She paused. "He fought for me when he didn't have to. Now he needs someone to fight for him." Rousseau leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "You're aware that investigating this could destroy what little practice I have? That Philippe Marchand has connections throughout the legal system?" "Yes." "And you're aware that even if we found evidence, reopening a closed case is nearly impossible? That the courts don't like admitting they were wrong?" "Yes." "And you're still asking me to help?" "I'm still asking." Rousseau was quiet for another long moment, then he pulled a sheet of paper toward him and picked up his pen. "Tell me about the clerk. Laurent Dubois. What exactly did the Duke say he'd noticed?" Hope flickered in Helena's chest. "Irregularities in signatures. He processed the financial documents that supposedly proved the Duke had embezzled from Fournier. But something about them raised doubts. If we could get those documents, have them examined by a handwriting expert, we might be able to prove forgery." Rousseau tapped his pen against the desk. "But accessing sealed case files requires court authorization, which requires probable cause, which requires evidence we don't have. It's circular. What if the documents weren't sealed? What if there were copies elsewhere? Such as..." Helena thought quickly. "Fournier's business records. If Philippe forged the Duke's signature on financial transfers, there must have been original documents, ledgers, contracts, correspondence. Fournier's estate would have those materials. Fournier died months ago. His estate would have been settled, his business dissolved. But the records would still exist somewhere. In storage, or with his family, or held by the bankruptcy court." Helena felt momentum building. "If we could find the originals and compare them to what was presented at trial, we could prove the forgery." Rousseau began writing notes. "Fournier's estate was handled by Maître Colbert, a colleague of mine. He might be willing to tell me where the business records ended up, especially if I frame it as a professional inquiry rather than an investigation." He looked up at Helena. "This is a long shot. You understand that?" "I understand. And if Philippe discovers what we're doing, he'll move to stop us. Legally if possible, otherwise if necessary." "I know." Rousseau studied her for another moment, then nodded decisively. All right. I'll contact Colbert today, see what I can learn about Fournier's records. In the meantime, you should stay away from Philippe and anyone connected to him. No more investigating on your own, it's too dangerous. Helena
Por
wanted to
favor, você
argue
tem que
but
sair
recognized
daqui.
the wisdom in his
Eu não
words.
posso te perder.
She'd pushed as far as she could
Tarde demais, meu
alone.
amor.
Now she needed to trust
eu
someone
sempre
with
vou te
more
amar.
resources and authority to take the next steps. How will you contact me? She asked. Where do you work? Various households. I take commissions wherever I can find them. Rousseau pulled out a card with his office address. Check back here in 2 days. If I've learned anything useful, we'll plan our next move. Helena took the card, feeling the weight of what they'd set in motion. Thank you, Maître Rousseau, for believing me. I haven't decided if I believe you yet, he said, but his tone was gentle. But I believe in checking facts before accepting official versions. And I remember the Duke's testimony years ago. He didn't have to help workers then, but he did. That deserves at least an honest investigation now. Helena left the office feeling both lighter and more burdened. She had an ally, someone with legal knowledge and professional standing. But she'd also escalated the situation, involved another person in Philippe's web. If anything happened to Rousseau because of her, that weight would be hers to carry. She made her way home through afternoon crowds, constantly aware of faces around her, wondering if Philippe had people watching her movements. The paranoia felt justified rather than excessive. Powerful men who'd committed fraud and possibly worse wouldn't hesitate to monitor potential threats. When she reached her building, Martin was waiting in the narrow entryway, his presence immediately alarming. He never came to her home, it was too visible, too traceable. What's wrong? Helena asked. The Duke, Martin said quietly. He's been moved. Not to his estate, not to exile. To a private facility outside the city. Philippe claims it's for his own protection, but the guards I spoke with said it's essentially imprisonment. No visitors, no correspondence, complete isolation. Helena felt cold spreading through her chest. Philippe is removing him from Paris entirely. Making sure no one can reach him, no one can hear his side of things. It's worse than that. Martin's expression was grim. I overheard Philippe's assistant talking. They're planning to have the Duke declared mentally incompetent. Say his accusations at the ceremony were evidence of delusion, that he needs medical confinement for his own welfare. Once that's official, nothing he says will have legal standing. He'll be dismissed as a madman. The elegance of it was terrifying. Philippe wasn't just destroying Etienne's reputation. He was ensuring that even if the truth emerged, it would be attributed to mental illness rather than accepted as fact. It was comprehensive, methodical, and devastatingly effective. How long do we have? Helena asked. The competency hearing is scheduled for 5 days from now. Expedited, naturally. Once that ruling comes through, it's almost impossible to reverse. 5 days to find evidence, build a case, and stop Philippe's machinery. 5 days to save a man who was being systematically erased from credibility and existence. Helena looked at Martin. Can you get a message to him? Tell him we're working on something, that he needs to hold on just a little longer? I'll try. But Helena, 5 days isn't enough time. Even if we find evidence, getting a hearing, presenting it properly, convincing officials to reconsider. He trailed off, the impossibility evident in his silence. Then we work faster, Helena said simply.
Eu não posso te
We don't
perder.
have the luxury of time.
Tarde demais, meu amor.
Helena spent a sleepless night
Mas eu
planning.
sempre vou te amar.
5 days meant no wasted moments, no false leads, no hesitation. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She couldn't wait 2 days for Rousseau to contact Colbert. They needed to move faster, take bigger risks. She left Amélie with the neighbor and went directly to Rousseau's office, arriving before the streets were fully awake. She found him already at his desk, surrounded by even more papers than before. I was going to send for you, he said when she entered. I spoke with Colbert last night. Helena's heart quickened. What did he say? Fournier's business records are in storage at a warehouse in Belleville. The bankruptcy court ordered them preserved for 7 years in case of appeals or additional claims. Colbert gave me the location. Rousseau paused. He also warned me that Philippe's lawyers visited the same warehouse 3 weeks ago. They examined the records but didn't remove anything, probably didn't want to leave evidence of tampering. So the documents are still there? According to the warehouse manager, yes. But there's a problem. The records are sealed by court order. Only authorized parties can access them, which means we'd need official permission. How long would that take? Weeks, maybe months. We'd have to petition the court, provide justification, wait for a hearing. We have 5 days, Helena interrupted. Philippe is having the Duke declared incompetent. Once that happens, nothing we find will matter. Rousseau's expression darkened. Incompetent? On what grounds? His accusations at the ceremony. Philippe is claiming they're evidence of mental instability. Helena leaned forward urgently. We need those documents now, not in weeks. Is there any way to access them without court permission? You're asking me to break the law. I'm asking you to prevent a greater injustice. Rousseau stood and paced his small office. Even if we obtained the records illegally, they couldn't be used in court. Any evidence gathered improperly would be inadmissible. But we could examine them privately, find the proof of forgery, then use that knowledge to pressure Philippe or convince officials to open a legitimate investigation. It's risky. If we're caught, I'd be disbarred. You could be arrested for theft. Helena thought of Etienne, isolated in Philippe's chosen facility, being systematically discredited and erased. She thought of Amélie, watching to see if her mother's words about dignity and justice meant anything when tested by reality. I'll go alone, she said. You tell me where the warehouse is, what to look for in the documents. If I'm caught, you knew nothing about it? I acted independently. Absolutely not. You wouldn't know what you're looking at. Financial records are complex, and we need to identify specific irregularities, forged signatures, altered dates, inconsistent details. Rousseau stopped pacing and faced her. If we're doing this, we do it together. Tonight, when the warehouse is closed. We find what we need, document it carefully, and get out. You're certain? No. But I'm certain that doing nothing guarantees injustice. Sometimes that's the only certainty we get. He pulled out a map of Paris and marked a location. The warehouse is here. Meet me 3 streets away at midnight. Dress in dark clothes, bring a lantern if you have one. Helena spent the day in a state of controlled anxiety, completing commissioned work with mechanical precision while her mind rehearsed the night ahead. She told the neighbor she had an emergency commission that required working through the night, a lie that came easier than she'd expected. Amélie accepted the explanation with her usual trust, and Helena kissed her daughter goodbye with a fear that felt like premonition. At 1:45, she left her apartment dressed in her darkest skirt and Jean-Luc's old work coat, a hooded lantern hidden beneath the fabric. The streets were quiet except for occasional drunks and night workers. She moved quickly, staying in shadows, her heart hammering. Rousseau was waiting at the designated corner, similarly dressed in dark clothes. He nodded grimly when she approached. The warehouse manager lives off-site, he whispered. There's a night watchman who makes rounds every 2 hours. His last round was at 11. We should have until 1 o'clock. They moved through empty streets to the warehouse district, where buildings loomed like sleeping giants. Rousseau led her to a nondescript structure with barred windows and a heavy padlock on the main door. There's a side entrance, he said, producing a set of lock picks. Colbert mentioned the warehouse has poor security. Let's hope he was right. Helena watched nervously as Rousseau worked the lock, the small metallic sounds impossibly loud in the silence. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, something clicked and the door swung inward. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The warehouse interior was a maze of shelves stacked with crates and boxes, each labeled with case numbers and dates. Rousseau lit his lantern, keeping the light low. Fournier's records should be in Section J, case number 1847B, he whispered, consulting notes he'd written earlier. They navigated through narrow aisles, checking labels. Helena's nerves felt electric, every small sound a potential threat. Finally, Rousseau stopped before a large wooden crate marked with the correct case number. This is it, he said. They pried open the crate to reveal stacks of ledgers, correspondence files, and financial documents. Rousseau began examining them systematically, his trained eye scanning for relevant materials. Here, he said suddenly, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. Fournier's primary business accounts. If Philippe forged transfer documents, they would reference transactions that should appear here. Helena held the lantern steady while Rousseau compared entries. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Rousseau inhaled sharply. Look at this. He pointed to a ledger entry dated 18 months ago. This records a payment to the Duke, 5,000 francs for his share of textile profits. Now look at the signature. Helena leaned closer, studying the careful script of Etienne's name. Now compare it to this. Rousseau produced a folded document from inside his coat, a copy of the trial evidence he'd obtained from Colbert. This is supposedly the Duke's signature authorizing an embezzlement transfer. Same date, similar amount. But look closely at the signatures. Helena studied both documents. Even to her untrained eye, differences were visible. The authentic signature had flowing confidence. The forged one showed slight hesitation in certain letters, subtle differences in pressure and angle. "They're not the same," she whispered. "No," Rousseau agreed. "They're not." Someone copied the Duke's signature,
Por
but not
favor, você tem que
perfectly.
sair daqui.
A handwriting
Eu não
expert
posso
would
te
confirm it
perder.
immediately.
É tarde demais,
Footsteps
meu amor.
echoed suddenly from the front
Mas
of
eu
the
sempre vou
warehouse.
te amar.
Both of them froze. "The watchman," Rousseau breathed. "He's early." The lantern light suddenly felt like a beacon announcing their presence. Rousseau extinguished it immediately, plunging them into darkness. Helena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain it could be heard across the warehouse. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the swing of another lantern casting moving shadows across the aisles. A gruff voice hummed tunelessly, the watchman clearly unaware of intruders. Rousseau's hand found Helena's arm, guiding her silently deeper into the maze of shelves. They moved with agonizing slowness, each step carefully placed to avoid knocking into crates or creating sound. The footsteps paused nearby, and Helena held her breath until her lungs burned. "Who's there?" the watchman called suddenly. They froze completely. Had he heard something? Seen movement? Long seconds passed. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from their location toward the front of the warehouse. Rousseau waited until the sound faded, then whispered directly against Helena's ear, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave. Now, can you carry the ledger?" Helena nodded, remembering too late he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Yes," she breathed. Rousseau pressed the heavy ledger into her hands along with several folded documents. "Keep them hidden under your coat. If we're separated, take them to my office. Don't let anyone see them." They moved toward the side entrance, navigating by memory and the faint moonlight filtering through high windows. Behind them, the watchman's footsteps echoed from another section of the warehouse. They reached the door and Rousseau eased it open, the hinges creaking softly. They slipped out into the night air, and Helena nearly gasped with relief. But Rousseau grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadow of the building. Across the street, two figures stood smoking cigarettes, their postures casual but their positioning deliberate. They were watching the warehouse. "Philippe's men," Rousseau whispered. "He must have suspected someone might try this." Helena's relief evaporated. They were trapped between the watchman inside and Philippe's guards outside. If they tried to leave, they'd be seen immediately. If they stayed, the watchman would eventually discover the opened crate and raise the alarm. "There's an alley behind the building," Helena whispered, remembering the warehouse district's layout from deliveries she'd made years ago. "It connects to the next street over." They edged along the building's wall, staying in deep shadow. The guards across the street remained focused on the main entrance, not expecting anyone to emerge from the side. Helena and Rousseau reached the corner and slipped into the narrow alley, pressing themselves against the damp stone wall. The alley was barely wide enough for one person, cluttered with refuse and debris. They moved as quickly as silence allowed, the ledger heavy and awkward under Helena's coat. Behind them, a shout went up from the warehouse. The watchman had discovered something. "Faster," Rousseau urged. They emerged onto an adjacent street and immediately separated, as they'd previously agreed if things went wrong. Rousseau headed north while Helena turned south, both moving with purpose but not quite running. Running drew attention. Helena's legs carried her through darkened streets, her mind focused on protecting the
Por
ledger
favor,
pressed
você tem
against
que
her
sair
body.
daqui.
Every
Eu não
shadow
posso
seemed
te
threatening,
perder.
every
É
footstep
tarde demais,
behind
meu
her
amor.
potentially pursuit.
Mas eu
She
sempre
took a
vou te amar.
circuitous route home, doubling back several times to ensure she wasn't followed. By the time she reached her building, dawn was painting the eastern sky pale gray. She climbed the stairs on trembling legs and locked herself inside her apartment. Only then did she remove the ledger and documents from beneath her coat, laying them on the small table like sacred objects. Amelie slept peacefully, unaware of her mother's night activities. Helena sat watching her daughter while her heartbeat gradually returned to normal, thinking about what they'd discovered and what it meant. The forged signatures were proof, but Rousseau was right. Illegally obtained evidence couldn't be used in court. They needed another approach, a way to leverage this knowledge without revealing how they'd acquired it. Perhaps they could convince Laurent Dubois to testify after all, now that they knew exactly what he'd noticed. Or find the handwriting expert who might have been consulted during the original forgery, someone Philippe had paid for their expertise in their silence. A knock at the door made her jump. She quickly hid the ledger and documents under her mattress before opening the door cautiously. Martin stood in the hallway, his face grave. "I have news. The Duke's competency hearing has been moved up. It's tomorrow morning instead of 5 days from now." Philippe is accelerating everything. Helena felt the ground shift beneath her. Tomorrow? That's impossible. We need more time. Philippe must suspect someone is investigating. He's pushing the hearing through before opposition can form. Martin glanced down the hallway nervously. There's more. The facility where the Duke is being held, I spoke with a supply clerk who delivers there. He says the Duke is being given medication, something to keep him sedated. By tomorrow's hearing, he'll barely be able to speak coherently. Philippe is ensuring he appears exactly as unstable as the petition claims. Helena's mind raced. They had less than 24 hours to stop the hearing or present evidence compelling enough to delay it. Evidence they couldn't legally use and couldn't yet prove through legitimate channels. Where is Rousseau? Martin asked. You need to coordinate with him immediately. We separated after gathering information last night. He should be at his office soon. Helena checked the early morning light. I'll go there now. She roused Amélie gently, explaining they needed to visit someone important. The girl accepted this with sleepy trust, and Helena felt a pang of guilt for involving her daughter in this dangerous day. But leaving her seemed more dangerous. If Philippe's people came looking, she wanted Amélie where she could see her. They hurried through awakening streets to Rousseau's office. Helena took the stairs 2 at a time, the ledger once again hidden under her coat, and knocked urgently on his door. Rousseau opened it immediately, looking as exhausted as she felt. His expression brightened slightly when he saw the ledger. You made it safely. I wasn't certain. The hearing is tomorrow, Helena interrupted. Philippe moved it up. We're out of time. Rousseau's face went pale. He stepped back, letting them inside. Amélie settled quietly in a corner with a book while the adults spread the ledger and documents across the desk. Tomorrow, Rousseau repeated quietly. Then we have one option left. It's risky, possibly suicidal professionally,
Por favor,
but it's
você
all
tem que
we
sair
have.
daqui.
What
Eu
option?
não posso te perder.
We crash the hearing.
É tarde demais,
Present
meu
the
amor.
evidence publicly,
Mas eu
force the
sempre vou
judge
te
to
amar.
acknowledge it even though it was obtained improperly. It'll create chaos, likely get us both arrested, but it'll also create doubt. And doubt might be enough to delay the ruling, buy us time for a legitimate investigation. Helena looked at the documents, at Amélie reading peacefully, at Rousseau's determined face. They'd come this far. Retreating now meant abandoning everything. Tell me exactly what we need to do, she said. Rousseau spread a sheet of paper on his desk and began sketching a plan. The competency hearing will be at the Palais de Justice, probably in a small chamber rather than a public courtroom. Philippe will want minimal witnesses, just the judge, his own physicians who'll testify about the Duke's supposed instability, and Philippe himself as the concerned family member. Can we attend? Helena asked. Not officially. These hearings are usually closed to protect the subject's privacy. But there's always confusion in the corridors, people coming and going. If we arrive early, dressed appropriately, we might slip in before anyone questions our presence. Helena glanced down at her worn dress. I don't exactly look like I belong at the Palais de Justice. I have a colleague's wife who's approximately your size. I'll borrow something suitable. Rousseau continued sketching. Once inside, we wait for the physicians to present their evaluation. Then, before the judge can rule, I stand and request permission to present contradictory evidence. Will the judge allow it? Probably not. I'm not officially representing the Duke, and the evidence was obtained illegally. But the act of trying will create a record. Other people will be present. Court clerks, Philippe's lawyers, possibly a stenographer. They'll hear me reference forged documents and fraudulent signatures. That testimony becomes part of the public record, even if the judge refuses to examine the evidence. And then we're likely arrested for disrupting proceedings and illegally possessing court-sealed documents. Rousseau met her eyes. I'm serious about the consequences, Helena. This could mean jail time for both of us. You have a daughter to think about. Helena looked at Amélie, absorbed in her book. I'm thinking about her. About what kind of world I'm leaving her. One where people like Philippe win because everyone else is too afraid to act, or one where at least some people tried to fight back. Rousseau nodded slowly. Then we should prepare thoroughly. I'll draft a statement summarizing our findings, the forged signatures, the suspicious death of Fournier, the compensated witnesses. Even if the judge won't let me speak, I can submit it as a formal objection. That creates a paper trail. They spent the morning preparing. Rousseau wrote and rewrote his statement, crafting language that was legally precise but emotionally compelling. Helena examined the ledger entries again, memorizing details in case the documents were confiscated. Martin arrived at midday with news that the Duke was being transported to the Palais at dawn tomorrow. heavily sedated as predicted. Is there any way to reach him before the hearing? Helena asked. Warn him what we're planning? I tried, Martin said. But the facility has him completely isolated. Not even servants are allowed near his room. He paused. However, I did learn something useful. The physician Philippe hired to evaluate the Duke, Dr. Mercier, has gambling debts. Substantial ones. Philippe paid them off 3 weeks ago. Rousseau looked up sharply. Can you prove that? I have a friend who works at the gentleman's club where Mercier gambles. He says Philippe's secretary personally delivered payment to clear the doctor's accounts. Martin pulled out a folded paper. I convinced my friend to write down what he witnessed. It's not legal testimony, but it's something. It establishes motive for false diagnosis, Rousseau said, taking the paper carefully. If we can show the physician was financially compromised, it undermines his credibility. He added the statement to his growing pile of materials. We're building something here. Not enough to win, but enough to create reasonable doubt. The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Rousseau's colleague sent over a dress for Helena, simple but respectable, the kind a clerk's wife might wear. Helena tried it on, feeling strange and borrowed gentility, but Rousseau nodded approval. You look credible. That matters. The judge needs to see you as someone serious, not a conspiracy theorist. As evening approached, they finalized their strategy. Rousseau would do most of the talking, leveraging his legal standing. Helena would be present as a witness, ready to speak if called upon. They'd arrive at the Palais de Justice at dawn, enter through the public access, and find the hearing room through careful inquiry. What about Amélie? Rousseau asked gently. You can't bring her to a court proceeding, especially one where you might be arrested. Helena had been avoiding this question all day. Martin, could you? I'll watch her, Martin said immediately. My wife and I will keep her safe no matter what happens. You have my word. Helena knelt before her daughter. Mon cœur, tomorrow I need to do something very important. You'll stay with Monsieur Martin and his wife. Can you be brave for me? Amélie studied her mother's face with unsettling perception. Is this about the sad man? Yes. Are you in danger? Helena wouldn't lie to her. Possibly. But some things are worth the risk. Amélie considered this, then nodded with a seriousness beyond her years. Papa would say the same thing. The words hit Helena like a physical blow. Jean-Luc had indeed believed some things were worth risking everything for: worker safety, dignity, justice. He'd spoken at factory meetings knowing it might cost him his job, had testified at hearings knowing management would retaliate. His principles had been both his strength and ultimately his vulnerability. Yes, Helena whispered. He would say exactly that. That night Helena barely slept. She lay next to Amélie, watching shadows move across the ceiling, rehearsing what she might say if given the chance to speak. She thought about Etienne, sedated and alone, facing judgment without the ability to defend himself. She thought about Philippe, so certain of his victory that he'd accelerated the timeline. That confidence might be his weakness. He wouldn't expect opposition tomorrow, wouldn't have prepared for someone to challenge the proceedings. Before dawn, Helena rose and dressed carefully in the borrowed clothes. She braided her hair simply, tucked the ledger and documents into a satchel Rousseau had provided, and kissed her sleeping daughter goodbye. Martin arrived as planned. My wife has breakfast ready. Amélie will be comfortable and safe. If something goes wrong today, if I don't come back, there's money hidden in a box under the floorboard by the window. It's not much, but enough for a few weeks. And tell Amélie. Helena's voice caught. Tell her I love her. Tell her this mattered. You'll tell her yourself, Martin said firmly. Now go. Rousseau is waiting. Helena met Rousseau outside the Palais de Justice as the city stirred to life. The building loomed imposing in the early light, its classical facade designed to project authority and permanence. They climbed the broad steps together, two ordinary people about to challenge an entire system. Ready? Rousseau asked quietly. Helena thought of her daughter, her dead husband, the Duke who'd fought for workers when he didn't have to, and all the people who'd suffered because powerful men faced no accountability. Ready, she said. They walked through the massive doors into the marble interior, where their reckoning waited. The Palais de Justice bustled with early morning activity, lawyers consulting in hushed tones, clerks carrying files, petitioners waiting nervously on wooden benches. Helena and Rousseau moved through the corridors with purposeful confidence, as if they belonged exactly where they were. Chamber 7, Rousseau murmured, reading from a posted schedule. That's where competency hearings are typically held. They climbed a marble staircase to the second floor and found the chamber at the end of a quieter hallway. The door stood closed, but voices filtered from within. Rousseau tested the handle, locked. They'd have to wait for someone to enter or exit. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Then footsteps approached and a court clerk appeared carrying a stack of documents. Rousseau stepped forward smoothly. "Pardon me, we're here for the Marchand competency hearing. Are we early?" The clerk barely glanced at them. "Hearing starts in 20 minutes. You can wait inside." He unlocked the door and held it open. They entered a small chamber designed for private proceedings. Wooden benches faced a raised platform where the judge would sit. A table for witnesses stood to one side. The room was empty except for them and the clerk, who arranged his documents and left without further interest. "That was remarkably easy," Helena whispered. "People see what they expect to see. We look like we belong, so they assume we do." Rousseau chose seats near the back where they could observe without drawing immediate attention. The chamber gradually filled. Two physicians arrived, consulting quietly, one of them presumably Dr. Mercier with his compromised credibility. Philippe entered next, immaculate in expensive clothing, exuding controlled confidence. His eyes swept the room and paused briefly on Rousseau, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, but he said nothing. Then they brought in Etienne. Helena's breath caught. The Duke looked nothing like the composed man she'd met in his quarters. His face was pale and slack, his eyes unfocused, his movements sluggish as guards helped him to a chair. The sedation was obvious, transforming him into exactly the kind of diminished figure Philippe needed the judge to see. Anger burned in Helena's chest. This wasn't justice, it was theater designed to produce a predetermined outcome. The judge entered, an elderly man with a stern face and weary eyes. Everyone stood until he took his seat, then settled again. The clerk called the proceeding to order. In the matter of Philippe Marchand's petition regarding the mental competency of Etienne Marchand, the judge began, his voice formal and detached. "We are here to determine whether the subject requires medical guardianship for his own welfare. Dr. Mercier, please present your evaluation." The physician stood and delivered his assessment with practiced smoothness. He described a patient suffering from paranoid delusions, persecution complexes, and an inability to distinguish truth from fabrication. He cited the public outburst at the ceremony as evidence of deteriorating mental state, recommended immediate guardianship to prevent self-harm or harm to others. It was a masterful performance, clinical language masking what was essentially character assassination. Etienne sat motionless throughout, barely seeming to register the words destroying him. The second physician concurred with the evaluation. Philippe testified with apparent reluctance, expressing sorrow over his cousin's decline, accepting the burden of guardianship with noble resignation. It was all proceeding exactly as planned. "Does anyone wish to speak on behalf of the subject?" the judge asked, a formality since no one had been notified to represent Etienne. Rousseau stood. "Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence relevant to this proceeding." The judge's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Maître André Rousseau, attorney at law. I represent workers who have benefited from the Duke's advocacy and have knowledge of relevant facts." Philippe's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Maître Rousseau has no standing in this matter and wasn't registered to appear." "Nevertheless," Rousseau continued, "I have evidence suggesting the behavior cited as proof of mental incompetence was actually a rational response to systematic fraud perpetrated against the Duke." The chamber erupted in whispers. The judge struck his gavel sharply. "Order. Maître Rousseau, these are serious accusations. What evidence do you claim to possess?" "Documents proving that signatures attributed to the Duke were forged, that witnesses against him were compensated, and that the physician currently recommending guardianship was financially compromised by the petitioner 3 weeks ago." Dr. Mercier shot to his feet, face flushed. "That's a vicious lie." "Is it?" Rousseau produced Martin's statement. "I have written testimony from a witness who observed Philippe Marchand's secretary paying your gambling debts at the Saint-Germain Gentlemen's Club." Philippe stood, his composure finally cracking. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to disrupt legitimate proceedings. I demand these accusations be stricken from the record and Maître Rousseau be held in contempt." "I second that motion," his lawyer added quickly. The judge studied Rousseau with an unreadable expression. "These are extraordinary claims, Maître Rousseau. Can you substantiate them?" "I can, Your Honor. I have financial ledgers from Auguste Fournier's business showing authentic signatures by the Duke, which differ markedly from signatures on documents used to convict him of fraud. A handwriting expert would confirm forgery immediately. How did you obtain sealed court documents? The judge asked sharply. Rousseau hesitated just a moment. Through irregular means, Your Honor. I acknowledge that. But the evidence itself is genuine and demonstrates that this competency proceeding is based on false premises. Philippe's lawyer pounced. Your Honor, Maître Rousseau has just admitted to illegally obtaining sealed evidence. Nothing he presents can be considered admissible. I move for immediate dismissal of his objections and his arrest for obstruction of justice. The judge looked troubled now, caught between legal procedure and the possibility of genuine corruption. Maître Rousseau, you understand that illegally obtained evidence cannot be accepted by this court? I understand, Your Honor. But I'm not asking you to rule based on this evidence. I'm asking you to delay this proceeding and order an independent investigation into the original fraud case. The irregularities I've identified warrant examination, regardless of how they came to my attention. This is absurd, Philippe said, his voice rising. My cousin is clearly delusional, and now he's inspired others to share his delusions. This is exactly why he needs guardianship. He's a danger to himself and others. Helena stood before she could stop herself. That's not true. Every eye in the chamber turned to her. The judge frowned. And who are you? Helena Moreau, Your Honor. A seamstress. I've witnessed events relevant to this case. Philippe's face went white, then flushed with rage. This woman is nobody. She has no business in this proceeding. Let her speak, the judge said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he was beginning to doubt the neat narrative he'd been presented. Helena took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything depended on her next words. I am due Capitulo 12. Helena stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Your Honor, I'm a seamstress who has worked for various noble households. 6 months ago, I witnessed Philippe Marchand meeting with Auguste Fournier late at night, arguing violently about financial matters. 2 weeks later, Monsieur Fournier was dead, supposedly from natural causes, though he'd been in perfect health. Philippe's lawyer interrupted. Your Honor, this is hearsay from an unreliable witness with obvious bias. Let her finish, the judge said, his attention now fully engaged. Helena continued. I also spoke with Laurent Dubois, the prefecture clerk who processed the fraud case documents. He noticed irregularities in the signatures but was threatened into silence. He fled Paris the night after the Duke's public accusation because Philippe's people visited him with clear threats. Lies, Philippe said coldly. Pure fabrication from someone the Duke clearly manipulated. Then explain why you paid Dr. Mercier's gambling debts 3 weeks before this competency hearing, Helena shot back, her fear transforming into anger. Explain why you accelerated the hearing when you learned people were investigating. Explain why witnesses against the Duke all received unexplained financial windfalls after testifying. The judge held up his hand for silence. These are serious allegations. He turned to Philippe. Monsieur Marchand, did you pay Dr. Mercier's debts? I may have helped an old friend during financial difficulties, Philippe said carefully. That's hardly evidence of conspiracy. And the timing doesn't concern you? That this help came just before you needed a physician to evaluate your cousin. Coincidence, Your Honor. The judge looked at Dr. Mercier. Doctor, is this true? Did Monsieur Philippe Marchand pay your gambling debts? Mercier's face had gone gray. Your Honor, my personal finances have no bearing on my professional evaluation. Answer the question. Did he pay your debts? A long silence. Then quietly, yes. The chamber erupted. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly. Order. I will have order. When quiet returned, the judge's expression had hardened. Maître Rousseau, you claim to have documents proving forgery. Present them. Your Honor, Philippe's lawyer objected desperately, those documents were obtained illegally. They're inadmissible. I'm not conducting a trial, counselor. I'm conducting a competency hearing, and I now have reason to question whether the subject's supposedly delusional claims have merit. The judge looked at Etienne, still sitting motionless and sedated. If this man was falsely convicted of fraud, then his accusations aren't evidence of delusion, they're evidence of clarity. Rousseau approached with the ledger and documents, laying them before the judge. Your Honor, this ledger shows genuine signatures by the Duke. These documents, he indicated the trial evidence, show signatures purporting to be his, used to convict him of embezzlement. The differences are clear even to an untrained eye. The judge examined both carefully, comparing the signatures side by side. Minutes passed in tense silence. Finally he looked up, his expression grave. These signatures are notably different. He turned to Philippe. Monsieur Marchand, can you explain this discrepancy? Your Honor, I'm not a handwriting expert. Perhaps the Duke's signature naturally varies. Not this substantially. The judge closed the ledger. I'm suspending this competency hearing pending a full investigation into the original fraud case. The subject will be released from the medical facility and returned to house arrest at his estate until this matter is resolved. Your Honor, you can't, Philippe began. I can and I am. Furthermore, I'm ordering the prefecture to investigate the circumstances of Auguste Fournier's death, the compensation of witnesses in the fraud trial, and Dr. Mercier's financial relationship with you. The judge's voice was ice. If even half of what's been alleged here proves true, this court has been used as an instrument of fraud. That is intolerable. Philippe stood frozen, his carefully constructed plan collapsing. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Philippe shook his head, his face contorted with rage and desperation. This is absurd, Philippe said, his composure shattering. You're taking the word of a seamstress and a minor lawyer over mine? I am Philippe Marchand. My family has served this country for generations. Your family name doesn't place you above the law, the judge said coldly. Guards, escort Monsieur Philippe Marchand to holding while we sort this matter out. Dr. Mercier as well, pending investigation of his conduct. As guards moved toward Philippe, his eyes found Helena. The hatred in them was pure and burning. You've destroyed yourself, he said quietly. You and everyone you love. This isn't over. No, Helena agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. It isn't. But now it will be done in daylight where everyone can see. The guards led Philippe and Mercier away. The chamber gradually emptied, leaving Rousseau, Helena, and the slowly stirring form of Etienne, the sedatives beginning to wear off enough for awareness to return. Helena approached him cautiously.
Por favor,
Your Grace,
você tem que sair daqui.
can you hear me?
Eu não posso te
Etienne's
perder.
eyes focused with
É tarde
effort.
demais, meu amor.
Recognition flickered across his
Mas eu sempre
features.
vou te amar.
Madame? Moreau. His voice was thick, uncertain. What happened? You won, she said simply. Or at least you didn't lose. The judge ordered an investigation. You're being released. Tears formed in Etienne's eyes, whether from relief, exhaustion, or the lingering effects of sedation, Helena couldn't tell. You did this. You and Rousseau. We all did, Rousseau said, joining them. Including you when you refused to apologize at the ceremony. That's what started everything. A court clerk approached. The Duke's carriage is being prepared. He'll be transported to his estate within the hour. She looked at Helena and Rousseau. The judge wishes to see you both in his chambers. Now. They exchanged glances. The moment of triumph was passing and consequences waited. In the judge's private chambers, the elderly man studied them with an expression mixing respect and exasperation. What you did today was legally questionable, ethically complicated, and probably saved an innocent man from permanent imprisonment. I don't know whether to commend or censure you. Your Honor, Rousseau began. I'm not finished. The evidence you obtained illegally cannot be used in any criminal proceeding against Philippe Marchand. However, it has provided sufficient cause for a legitimate investigation. If that investigation produces proper evidence, Philippe will face justice. He paused. You two will likely face charges for breaking into the warehouse. Probably minor ones given the circumstances, but charges nonetheless. Helena absorbed this calmly. She'd known the risks. However, the judge continued, I suspect any prosecutor will have difficulty convincing a jury to convict people who exposed genuine corruption. Public sentiment matters, and this story will spread quickly. He stood, signaling the interview's end. You've done something significant today. Don't waste it by becoming reckless. Go home. Stay available for questioning. And pray the investigation confirms what you've claimed. Outside the Palais, morning had become afternoon. Helena felt exhausted and exhilarated simultaneously, the adrenaline draining away to leave her shaking. You were extraordinary in there, Rousseau said. Truly. I was terrified. Courage and terror aren't mutually exclusive. He smiled tiredly. Go collect your daughter. I'll handle the legal aftermath, prepare for whatever comes next. Helena nodded, then impulsively hugged him. Thank you. For believing me. For risking everything. Thank you for reminding me why I became a lawyer, he replied. Helena walked through Paris toward Martin's home, each step feeling surreal. They'd actually done it. Against all odds, against Philippe's power and resources, They'd forced the truth into daylight. But Philippe's final words haunted her. This isn't over. She knew he was right. Men like Philippe didn't accept defeat gracefully. Even if he faced legal consequences, he had resources to make life difficult for those who'd opposed him. But that was tomorrow's concern. Today she needed to hold her daughter and remember why some battles were worth fighting regardless of cost. 3 months later, Helena stood at her window watching spring transform Paris. The city had awakened from winter with almost defiant vitality, trees budding along the boulevards, market stalls overflowing with early vegetables, people shedding heavy coats like discarded burdens. So much had changed since that morning at the Palais de Justice. The investigation had moved with surprising speed once magistrates understood the scope of Philippe's deception. Laurent Dubois, emboldened by the public proceedings, had returned to Paris and provided detailed testimony about the forged documents. A handwriting expert confirmed what Helena and Rousseau had discovered. The signatures were unmistakably fraudulent. More witnesses emerged, their consciences apparently loosened by Philippe's weakened position. A clerk admitted receiving payment to misfile documents. One of Philippe's own servants testified about late-night meetings with Auguste Fournier, bitter arguments about business dealings gone wrong. And most damning, a physician came forward to challenge the official cause of Fournier's death, suggesting poison rather than natural failure. Philippe Marchand was arrested 6 weeks after the competency hearing. His trial was swift and public, attended by crowds who'd grown fascinated by the story of a duke brought low by his own cousin's greed. The evidence was overwhelming. Philippe was convicted of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and suspected involvement in Fournier's death. His sentence, 20 years imprisonment and complete forfeiture of property and title. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Philippe had destroyed Etienne to claim what he believed was rightfully his, and in the end had lost everything himself. Etienne's conviction was formally overturned. His title, properties and reputation were legally restored, though everyone understood that some stains didn't wash away completely. Society's memory was long, and whispers would follow him regardless of official exoneration. But Etienne seemed less concerned with society's opinion than Helena had expected. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Etienne himself, dressed simply rather than in aristocratic finery, his expression warm and slightly nervous. "Your Grace," Helena said, still not entirely comfortable with informality despite his repeated requests. "Etienne," he corrected gently as he always did. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, suddenly aware of her apartment's modest dimensions, the worn furniture, the signs of poverty she'd grown too accustomed to notice. But Etienne entered without judgment, greeting Amélie with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Mademoiselle Amélie. Still reading that book about explorers?" "I finished it," Amélie announced proudly. "Now I'm reading about scientists." "Excellent choice." Etienne pulled a wrapped package from his coat. "I brought you something that might interest you then." Amélie opened it to reveal a beautifully illustrated book about natural philosophy. Her eyes went wide with delight, and Helena felt the familiar conflict between gratitude and discomfort with accepting gifts. "You're too generous," she said quietly. "Impossible. I can never repay what you've done for me." Etienne's expression grew serious. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I have something to discuss with you." Helena sent Amélie to read in the other room, then sat across from Etienne at her small table. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about my future, about what I want to do with this second chance you've given me. I could return to society, reclaim my position, pretend the past year never happened." He paused. "But that seems like a waste. I've learned something valuable from losing everything. I learned what actually matters. Which is using whatever power and resources I have to create genuine change, not just make symbolic gestures." Etienne leaned forward, his intensity evident. "I want to establish a legal aid organization for workers. Free representation for people facing exploitation, unsafe conditions, unfair dismissal. I have the funds to make it sustainable, and Rousseau has agreed to direct it." Helena felt hope stirring. "That would help so many people." "That's the idea. But I need someone to manage the practical side, intake of cases, coordination with workers' groups, communication with clients who might not trust lawyers or aristocrats." He met her eyes. "I want you to take that position. A real salary, proper working conditions, the ability to make a meaningful difference." Helena stared at him, momentarily speechless. I'm a seamstress. I have no training in legal matters." "You have something more valuable. You understand the workers' reality, you have their trust, and you've demonstrated extraordinary courage and judgment. The legal knowledge can be taught. Those other qualities can't. Etienne's voice softened. You risked everything to save someone you barely knew because you believed in justice. That's exactly the kind of person this organization needs. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it. Think about what it could mean, not just for you but for people like your late husband, for workers who currently have no voice when powerful interests harm them. Helena thought of Jean-Luc, who'd fought his entire life for worker dignity and died from industrial negligence no one was ever punished for. She thought of the seamstresses she knew, accepting starvation wages because they had no alternative. She thought of Amélie, watching to see if her mother's words about justice and courage translated into action. I'll do it, she said. I'd be honored. Etienne's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him since before his arrest. Thank you. Truly. He pulled out papers from his coat. Here's the formal offer including salary terms. Rousseau will handle training and we've secured offices near the prefecture. We're calling it the Workers' Legal Defense Fund. Helena scanned the papers, her eyes widening at the salary, more than she'd earned in 6 months of sewing. It was enough for proper housing, regular meals, perhaps even saving for Amélie's education. When do we start? She asked. 2 weeks. That gives you time to complete your current commissions and make arrangements. Etienne stood, preparing to leave, then paused. Helena, I need you to understand something. Philippe still has allies, people who resent what happened. This work we're proposing, helping workers challenge their employers, will make us targets. It won't be safe or easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Helena replied, echoing words her husband had often said. Your Jean-Luc was a wise man. He was. I think he'd approve of this. After Etienne left, Helena sat quietly with the papers, letting the reality settle over her. Her life was about to change fundamentally. No more struggling for commissions, no more wondering if there'd be food next week. But more than financial security, she'd have purpose, the chance to help others facing the same powerlessness she'd known. Amélie emerged from the other room. Maman, are you crying? Helena touched her face, surprised to find tears. Happy tears, mon cœur. Very happy tears. Because of the job the Duke Etienne offered? Yes. It means we can move to a better apartment. It means you can have books and proper clothes. But most importantly, it means I can help people the way your papa used to. Amélie considered this seriously. Will it be dangerous? Helena wouldn't lie to her daughter. Sometimes yes. There are people who don't want workers to have help or protection. They'll be angry about what we're doing. But you're going to do it anyway? Yes. Amélie nodded, that solemn maturity Helena both admired and mourned. Papa would be proud of you. I'm proud of you too. Helena pulled her daughter close, holding her tight. And I'm proud of you. For being brave when I had to leave you, for understanding why this matters. You're growing into an extraordinary person. They sat together in the afternoon light, mother and daughter, and Helena thought about the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, she'd been a widow struggling to survive, invisible to people with power, resigned to life's injustices. Then a chance encounter with a disgraced duke had set everything in motion. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. That ordinary people could challenge corruption if they refused to be silenced. That justice required champions willing to risk comfort and safety for principle. The following weeks passed in productive chaos. Helena completed her final sewing commissions, said goodbye to clients she'd worked with for years, and found a new apartment, modest still but with 2 proper rooms and windows that didn't rattle. Amélie enrolled in a better school, one with actual books and qualified teachers. The Workers' Legal Defense Fund opened its offices to immediate demand. Workers lined up seeking help with wage theft, unsafe conditions, wrongful dismissal, and injuries from negligent employers. Helena interviewed each person, documenting their cases, explaining what legal remedies might exist. Rousseau and 2 other lawyers handled the actual litigation, but Helena became the bridge between the legal world and the workers who needed it. She was good at it. Her own experience with poverty and powerlessness gave her credibility. She spoke workers' language, understood their fears and hesitations, knew which concerns were legitimate and which were misunderstandings of law. Within a month, she'd become indispensable to the organization's function. Etienne worked tirelessly alongside them, using his title and connections to pressure officials who'd rather ignore workers' complaints. His reputation, once tarnished by Philippe's schemes, was transforming into something different. Not the traditional aristocratic prestige, but respect earned through genuine commitment to justice. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Helena found Etienne in his office reviewing case files. She knocked gently on the open door. "We received 17 new requests today," she said. "Word is spreading. Workers across Paris are learning they have somewhere to turn." Etienne looked up, satisfaction evident despite his exhaustion. "That's what we wanted. Real impact, not symbolic gestures. You've sacrificed a great deal for this. Your social position, acceptance by your own class." "I've gained more than I've sacrificed," Etienne
Por favor,
interrupted
você tem que
gently.
sair daqui.
"Purpose,
Eu não
meaning
posso te
the knowledge
perder.
that I'm actually
É
useful
tarde
rather
demais,
than
meu amor.
ornamental. Besides,
Mas
the
eu
people
sempre
who
vou te
matter,
amar.
like you, like Rousseau, are still here. The ones who abandoned me when Philippe's lies seemed credible were never truly friends." Helena leaned against the doorframe. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't visited you that day? If you'd simply accepted Philippe's victory?" "Frequently. I'd probably be in permanent medical confinement, sedated and forgotten, while Philippe enjoyed everything he'd stolen." Etienne smiled. "Instead, I'm exhausted, working longer hours than I ever did as a duke, and happier than I've been in years. Life is strange." "It is," Helena agreed. "But sometimes it surprises us in good ways." 6 months after the Workers' Legal Defense Fund opened, they won their first major case. A factory owner held liable for a worker's death due to negligent safety conditions. The compensation awarded to the widow was modest, but the precedent was significant. Employers could be held accountable. Workers' lives had legal value. Helena attended the verdict with the widow, a woman named Claire whose husband had been killed by faulty machinery the owner had repeatedly refused to repair. When the judge announced the decision, Claire wept with relief and grief tangled together. "It won't bring him back," she said to Helena afterward. "But at least someone acknowledged his life mattered. That he wasn't just disposable." "He mattered," Helena said firmly. "And because you fought this case, other workers might be protected. Other widows might be spared what you've endured." That evening Helena walked home through Paris streets transformed by twilight. She thought about Jean-Luc, about all the workers who'd fought for dignity and fairness with so little support. She thought about Etienne, who'd lost everything and discovered what actually had value. She thought about Amélie, growing up in a world slightly better than the one Helena had inherited. The work was far from finished. Philippe's conviction hadn't eliminated corruption or exploitation. Workers still faced dangerous conditions, inadequate wages, powerlessness against wealthy interests. But now there was a foundation, a place to start, proof that ordinary people could challenge injustice and sometimes win. Helena reached her building and climbed the stairs to their apartment. Amélie was reading by the window, absorbed in her book, the lamp light casting gold across her serious young face. She looked up when her mother entered, smiling that particular smile that made everything worthwhile. "Good day?" Amélie asked. "Very good. We won the Durand case. Justice for once." "For once," Amélie echoed. Then, with that wisdom beyond her years, "But you'll keep fighting for it anyway." "Every day." "Every day," Helena confirmed. She hung up her coat and joined her daughter by the window, looking out at Paris settling into evening. Somewhere in the city, workers were finishing shifts, returning to families, hoping tomorrow might bring slightly better conditions. Somewhere, Etienne and Rousseau were planning their next cases, strategizing how to challenge the next injustice. And here, in this modest apartment, a widow and her daughter sat together in lamplight, testimony to the possibility of transformation. Helena had begun as nobody important, invisible to power, resigned to life's unfairness. She'd become someone who mattered, not through birth or wealth, but through
Por
courage
favor,
and
você tem que sair
conviction.
daqui.
The fight would
Eu não
continue.
posso te perder.
There would be setbacks
É
and
tarde
defeats,
demais, meu amor.
moments of despair and doubt.
Mas eu sempre vou
But
te
there would
amar.
also be victories, small and large, each one proving that justice wasn't just a fantasy for the privileged few. Helena Moreau had learned that one person, acting from principle rather than power, could change everything. It was a lesson she would carry forward, teaching by example, inspiring others to find their own courage. The seamstress who'd saved a duke had become something more. A voice for the voiceless, a champion for the forgotten, proof that extraordinary impact didn't require extraordinary birth. She was simply Helena. And that she'd finally learned was enough.